Imagine a story where love, loyalty, and betrayal collide in the life of one Marine veteran. In this gripping tale, we follow Luke, Hawkeye, Miller, a skilled mechanic and devoted soldier, who volunteers for Vietnam, leaving behind a seemingly perfect life with his wife, Tiffany. But war changes everything. As Luke fights for his country, he returns home to find his world turned upside down by betrayal, heartbreak, and the unexpected arrival of new love. Join us as we dive into this powerful narrative of resilience, redemption, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Luke, Hawkeye Miller was known around Carver Creek for two things: his skills as a mechanic and his unwavering commitment to the Marines. So, it wasn't a complete surprise when, in March of '67, he volunteered for a tour in Vietnam. He sat down with his wife, Tiffany, to break the news. They'd been married 3 years, had a cozy little house, and were starting to talk about kids. Tiffany worked as a paralegal, and between their two incomes, they were doing all right, even had a decent nest egg saved up. "You gotta come back to me in one piece, you hear?" Tiffany said, tears welling in her eyes. "And you stay away from those other women. I'm your girl, Luke. All yours." She gave his belt buckle a playful tug. Luke chuckled, pulling her close. "Don't you worry, doll. I'll be careful. You just behave yourself while I'm gone. I know how those hotshot lawyers can be." "Don't you worry about me," Tiffany said, forcing a smile. "I'll be good, I promise." Before shipping out, Luke updated his will and set up automatic payments from his military pay to cover the mortgage and bills. He even got a new tattoo, "Death Before Dishonor," etched across his forearm, a constant reminder of the oath he'd sworn. Vietnam was a whole other world. Luke was a fireteam leader, initially met with skepticism from the other guys since he was a reservist. But after a few hairy firefights, he'd earned their respect. Unlike some of the guys, Luke steered clear of the local women. He kept his wedding ring polished and wrote to Tiffany as often as he could, savoring every letter he got back. At first, her letters came like clockwork, every couple of weeks. But as the months dragged on, they became fewer and further between. It wasn't just that, either. He started getting more letters from his folks back home, even some photos of Tiffany in a swimsuit he'd never seen before. Made him wonder who was snapping those pictures. That Christmas, he got a card and a letter from his parents, but nothing from Tiffany. A knot of worry twisted in his gut, but he pushed it down, kept his head down, and his rifle close. By mid-January of '68, rumors were swirling around Da Nang about a major offensive by the Viet Cong, something big planned for the Tet Lunar New Year. And then all hell broke loose. Their position was overrun, pinned down under a brutal enemy assault. They fought like devils, but most of Luke's team, including Riley, didn't make it. Luke himself caught a bullet in the leg and was lucky to be alive. Medics evacuated him to Da Nang, and from there, he was flown to a military hospital in San Francisco. The doctors managed to save his leg, but he knew he was in for a long, tough recovery. The bullet had missed any major arteries, thankfully, but the scars were a stark reminder of the fight. A chunk of his ear had been shot away, and though the nurses said the scar gave him a distinguished air, he wasn't so sure. Still, he'd been awarded a Purple Heart for his troubles, and word was he was being put in for a Silver Star. Luke's parents were there to greet him when he landed back in the States, but his homecoming wasn't quite what he'd pictured. "Damn, son, I taught you how to duck." His dad, Frank, chuckled, trying to lighten the mood as he clapped Luke on the shoulder. But Martha, Luke's mom, just engulfed him in a hug, tears soaking his shirt. "Where's Tiffany?" Luke asked, scanning the crowd for his wife's familiar face. His parents exchanged a look. "Honestly, son, we don't know," Frank admitted. "We've been trying to reach her at home and at her office, but no luck. Just keep going straight to voicemail." "I haven't seen her in weeks," Martha added. "Been going by the house every weekend to keep things tidy and check for mail, but nothing." "Tell him, Frank," Martha urged. "Tell me what, Ma?" Luke pressed, a cold dread creeping up his spine. "What's going on?" Frank sighed. "Last time I saw Tiffany was about 2-3 months ago. I was driving up to the house, and this guy. He paused, choosing his words carefully. This guy was leaving. Got into a sports car, a Corvette I think, and took off like a bat out of hell. Saw Tiffany at the door in her bathrobe, waving goodbye. She didn't say anything to me when I got there. And I haven't seen her since. Luke's gut twisted. He believed in Tiffany, believed in their love, in the vows they'd made. But now he remembered the knowing look Riley had given him before that last mission, the warning about military wives and lonely nights. And that sports car. Was it a blue Corvette? Luke asked, his voice barely a whisper. Frank nodded slowly. Yeah, it was. How'd you know? It's Chad Sterling's, you know, that junior partner at her firm. So, she's not even around enough to check the mail? Luke muttered, feeling a rage building inside him. Doesn't seem like it, son. Frank said grimly. And Luke, I hope you don't mind, but I noticed a couple of bills marked final notice, so I went ahead and took care of them. Figured you wouldn't want to come home to no power and phone. Thanks, Dad. Luke sighed. I'll pay you back as soon as I can. Don't you worry about that right now. Frank insisted. Just focus on getting better. We can deal with all this later. Maybe we should look into getting power of attorney? If Tiffany's not handling the bills, who knows what else she's been neglecting? Could have cleaned you out by now for all we know. Luke felt a wave of anger wash over him. He was already dealing with the physical and emotional scars of war. Now, he had to worry about his own wife stabbing him in the back. He asked a nurse for help finding a military lawyer. Soon, a Navy lieutenant commander arrived and took down their statements. I'll get these papers drawn up for you, Corporal, the officer said, snapping his briefcase shut. This will give your parents power of attorney to handle things here. I suggest you consult with a family lawyer in Montana as soon as possible. I'll have everything ready for signatures this afternoon. Thank you, sir. Luke replied, his voice flat with exhaustion. After the lawyer left, Frank turned to his son. First thing tomorrow, I'm heading to the bank. I still have your spare key, so I'll swing by the house too, see what's what. And you remember Bill Thompson? Retired from the force a while back? He's working privately now. I can ask him to poke around a bit if you want. Don't know if I can afford a PI, Dad. Don't you worry about that, son. Frank said, shaking his head. Bill owes me a few favors. We go way back. Plus, I'll give our lawyer a call, see what he says. He used to handle a few domestic cases back in the day. He paused. Oh, and by the way, Big Ed said your job's still open at the garage. Been saving a quarter of your paychecks for you. Said the best damn mechanic in Montana wasn't getting away that easy. Thanks, Dad. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dirt on Luke's cheek. That woman. He trailed off, at a loss for words. His mother wrapped him in another hug. It'll be all right, son, she soothed. We're here for you. We'll get through this together. A few hours later, the paperwork was signed, notarized, and ready to go. Luke's parents said their goodbyes, promising to call with updates. As the door closed behind them, leaving him alone with his thoughts, the reality of his situation crashed down on him. His buddies were gone, his wife had betrayed him, and his future suddenly felt as uncertain as the battlefield he'd just left. He closed his eyes and tried to rest, but instead of Tiffany's face, all he could see were the ghosts of his fallen comrades. A few days passed. Luke was starting to get the hang of crutches when his dad called. Bad news, son, Frank said, his voice heavy. Tiffany, she cleaned out your accounts. Checking and savings, almost everything. Couple months back, she withdrew $800 cash. The only deposits since then have been your military paychecks. The teller said she comes in a few days after payday and takes everything but $5. Just enough to keep the account open. Anger pulsed through Luke's veins. All right, Dad, he said, trying to keep his voice level. Since you have power of attorney, just close the account, take her name off it. We don't have any joint credit cards, do we? No, we're good on that front. I'm taking care of it right now. Frank paused. And, I went by the house. His voice lowered. It's a mess, Luke. Dishes piled high. Food rotting on the counter. Smells like a biohazard zone. Looks like she took most of her stuff, but she left her wedding dress and photo album behind. Oh, and I found her rings, in the bathroom trash. At least the house is still standing, Luke muttered. Yeah. Frank sighed. Your mother's there now, trying to air the place out. The bed, well, let's just say I'm pretty sure she had company. Rage warred with a hollow ache in Luke's chest. Just get rid of it, Dad, he said, his voice tight. Throw it all out. I'll sleep on a cot if I have to. Will do, son, Frank assured him. Listen, Bill's willing to take your case pro bono. Said nobody messes with a soldier's girl on his watch. Found us a good lawyer too, same deal. Can't stand guys like Sterling, says he's got a reputation. We're changing the locks on the house, okay? Are you good with that? Yeah, Dad, sounds good. Hang in there, son. How are you holding up, really? I'm all right, Dad. Really? Frank saw right through him. Who are you trying to convince, Luke? Me or yourself? Luke managed a weak smile. His old man always could read him like a book. Dad, you ever lose men in combat? He knew it was a stupid question. Frank had been a second lieutenant in Korea, fought alongside Chesty Puller himself at the Chosin Reservoir. He knew more about loss than Luke ever wanted to. Yeah, son, I have. Did you? This might sound crazy, but did you ever dream about them? Talk to them? Every night at first, Frank said quietly. It gets easier. Not gone, but easier? Have you ever really gotten over it? You never completely get over it, Luke, Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. It becomes a part of you, like a scar you carry. You gotta make peace with it, learn to live with it. Or it'll eat you alive. The next couple of weeks were a blur. Luke heard from his parents every day with updates on Tiffany, or rather, the wreckage she was leaving in her wake. She'd moved in with Chad, and it was pretty clear she was pregnant with his kid. Apparently, it was the worst-kept secret at her law firm. On the legal front, things were moving along. Dan Campbell, the lawyer Bill had found, was filing for divorce on grounds of adultery and abandonment. He was also going after Chad for alienation of affection and planning to take action against Tiffany's firm for not enforcing their own morality clause. Apparently, they had one of those, ironic, considering. Bill had dug up some dirt on Chad that had Dan talking about additional charges, but Luke wasn't holding his breath. His folks told him Tiffany had completely lost it when she realized she couldn't touch his money anymore. Turns out she'd tried to get into the house, too, but Frank had changed the locks. Good thing, too. Luke couldn't imagine facing her right now. He poured all his energy into healing, finding a grim sort of satisfaction in Tiffany's meltdown. His body was mending, but his soul, that was a different story. He was haunted by the memories of his fallen brothers and the gut punch of betrayal. By the end of the second week, he was off crutches and learning to walk with a cane. The doctor cleared him to drive again, and he even got the cast off his leg. Back in his room, Luke noticed an orderly hanging up his dress greens. There was something different, though. He squinted. Sergeant Stripes. Before he could react, his doctor walked in. Congratulations, Sergeant Miller. You've been promoted. And, you're free to go. We've arranged for your physical therapy at the VA clinic back in Carver Creek. Luke was stunned. He'd expected to be stuck here for weeks. He threw on his uniform, crisp, starched, and sporting those brand new stripes, and grabbed his boots. Using his cane for support, he wheeled himself down to the day room. What he saw nearly knocked him off his feet. His parents were there, along with a handful of doctors and nurses, and standing ramrod straight in the middle of it all, Lieutenant Colonel Walker, his reserve battalion commander. Luke struggled to his feet, cane clattering to the floor. Colonel Walker, sir. At ease, Miller. Though, I gotta say, for a guy with a bum leg. Walker grinned, clapping a hand on Luke's shoulder. Just wanted to let you know how proud we are of you. Your loyalty and courage haven't gone unnoticed. And, may God have mercy on your enemies now, Sergeant. Laughter rippled through the room as Luke's parents proudly pinned his new stripes on. Then, in a voice that commanded respect, Walker launched into a formal citation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. They were the same words Luke had heard at countless ceremonies for others, but now they were for him. He stood at attention, chest swelling with a mix of pride and grief, as Walker pinned the silver star next to his purple heart. The trip home was a blur. Luke endured another wheelchair ride at the airport, even flipping off a group of long-haired protesters who called him a baby killer. Back in Carver Creek, his folks wheeled him through the door. It didn't feel like home anymore, not with Tiffany gone, but he was grateful for their love and support. His mom had stocked the fridge with beer and made a mountain of his favorite lasagna. He retreated to his room, traded his uniform for jeans and a t-shirt, and unpacked his sea bag. At the bottom, beneath the folded Htags and letters from home, lay a heavy, Bowie-style knife he'd found in Vietnam. The blade was rusty, but the leather sheath was well-oiled, stamped with a winged creature holding a sword and the words, Mark Ou Crev. He ran his fingers over the inscription, a shiver running down his spine. He'd have to find someone who could tell him more about it. He picked up the phone, calling Dan to set up a meeting for the next day. Then he called Bill. He deserved an update, and maybe a beer. He rested for a bit, then limped out to the garage. His old pickup truck was still there, gathering dust but looking ready to run. He'd have to change the oil and give it a good tune-up, but at least she hadn't sold it off. It was a start. After surveying his domain, Luke grabbed a beer from the fridge and sank into his recliner. His leg was throbbing, so he figured he deserved a little R&R. He flicked on the TV, settling for the mindless chatter of a game show, and dialed up Big Ed. Big Ed's auto, you break him, we fix him. Hey Ed, it's Luke. I'm back. 'Bout damn time. When you figurin' on getting back to work, son? Place ain't been the same without ya. Well, about that. Luke hesitated. Tiffany's filed for divorce. The line went silent for a moment. That right? Well, hell, take all the time you need to get that squared away. Court dates, doctor's appointments, whatever it takes. These young punks nowadays can't tell a brake pad from a carburetor. You stop by the garage sometime this week, you hear? Got a little something for ya. Will do, Ed. Thanks. Appreciate it. Later that afternoon, Dan and Bill stopped by. Luke invited them in, offered them beers, and they settled in the living room. Good to have you back, Luke, Bill said, clapping him on the shoulder. Your dad told me about the medal. Congratulations. Well deserved. But listen, we gotta talk. Got something you need to hear. Bill pulled a small reel-to-reel tape recorder from his briefcase, a cassette already loaded. Been keeping tabs on Tiffany and Sterling. Followed them to that steakhouse out on Route 41 a few nights back. Managed to snag us a table right next to them. They were too busy whispering sweet nothings to notice the mic I planted in the planter. Bill pressed play. Static crackled, then the sounds of clinking silverware and muffled conversation faded in. So, have you given any more thought to my proposal, Tiffany? A smooth, male voice asked. It was Chad, all right. Luke could practically hear the smug grin in his voice. I don't know, Chad. It's just, it feels wrong. I mean, cheating on Luke was bad enough, and now I'm carrying your child. I don't know if I can do that to him. Come on, babe, if anyone can pull this off, it's you. The guy's probably drowning his sorrows in rice paddy water right now. He'd do anything to have you back. You don't know Luke very well. He's got this moral code. There's no way he'd agree to raise this baby as his own. And he'd never share me, Chad. Never. Share you? Honey, please. He wouldn't have a choice. Look, we play this right, he'll never even suspect. And if he does, we threaten him with divorce. We'll take him for everything he's got. The house, half his income, the works. Alimony, child support, don't you worry, I've got it all figured out. Already got the paperwork drawn up. Bill clicked the recorder off. They actually think I'm gonna roll over and let them get away with this? Let him raise that kid? Are they insane? Luke's voice was tight with fury. It gets better, Bill said grimly, hitting play again. I don't know, Chad. Luke's not stupid. He won't go for it. Baby, you're worried about that jarhead? He's head over heels for you, you know it. He'd do anything for you. Are you still in love with him or something, Tiffany? There was a beat of silence. Well, I still care about him, I guess. But not like I used to. Besides, you're much better in bed. Luke's face was scarlet, his fists clenched. This is what I get, he thought bitterly. For loving her, for putting my life on hold. And I wouldn't let you go to Nam either. What kind of chump does that? Chad's voice dripped with disdain. Luke felt like putting his fist through a wall. Yeah, you're right. Tiffany giggled. When he gets back, I'll talk to him. Good girl. So, any idea when that'll be? No, haven't heard from him since January. And I haven't sent him anything since last year, like you said. Smart girl. Look, if he tries to play hardball, we have other options. Like what? Well, you know how houses sometimes catch fire. Or how can brakes suddenly fail? You'd hurt him? Chad, I'm not part of that. Relax, babe. Just sayin'. I know people. And besides, if anything were to happen to him, you get everything. Clean slate. No more Mr. Goody Two-Shoes. Bill hit the pause button. Don't worry your pretty little head about it, Chad said smoothly. It'd be clean. You'd be free and clear. Get the house, the money, everything. Well, I guess, Tiffany said hesitantly. But only as a last resort, right? If there's no other way? Of course, baby. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Let's see what kind of tune our war hero's singing when he gets back, shall we? Bill clicked the recorder off, a grim look on his face. Sounds like premeditated murder to me, Luke growled, jaw clenched. Bill and Dan exchanged a look. And conspiracy to commit fraud, Dan added. Not to mention theft, what with her cleaning out your bank accounts. That's why I filed the paperwork already and requested an expedited hearing. Also got an order of protection drawn up. They have to stay at least 100 feet away from you, your parents, and the house. I'm serving them the papers first thing tomorrow morning. I already talked to the DA, Bill added. He's putting together a case against them, and he's not messing around. Also had a chat with Robert Carter, you know, senior partner at their firm? We're old friends. He's fit to be tied to this. Told him we're considering suing the firm, too. By the time we're done, Sterling will be lucky to avoid disbarment, let alone jail time. My dad and we still got some friends down at the station, Bill assured him. They'll be keeping an eye out. Any questions so far? Bill asked. Yeah, just one, Luke said. What exactly am I asking for in this divorce? Dan handed him a folder. Sorry, forgot you haven't seen the paperwork. Your dad's been calling the shots so far. Anyway, like I said, we're going for adultery and abandonment. Since she makes more than you, there's no alimony on the table. You'll keep the house. She forfeited that right when she moved out and stopped paying the bills. We're demanding she return half the money she took. So, we're asking for $7,100 back, which is half of what was in your joint accounts. She can keep her clothes and the car. And I spoke to Carter about keeping her on at the firm, at least for now. She's gonna need some income once the baby comes. Generous of you, Luke muttered. Sterling, on the other hand, from what I hear, he's sitting on a pretty penny. We're suing him for $800,000. That, plus his legal fees, the firm's settlement, we're talking financial ruin. Oh, and we're also going after the firm directly for $2 million for not enforcing their morals clause. They'll probably settle out of court, though, for half that. Bad publicity and all. Good. Glad to hear it. Luke took a swig of his beer. One more thing. You got your dress blues handy? Yeah, back in my closet. Perfect. Get him cleaned, metals polished, the works. Wear him to court. I want everyone to see exactly what kind of man they messed with. I've got one more surprise up my sleeve, but I'll save that for later. Sounds good to me. Just let me know when and where. Will do. You just focus on healing up. I gotta run. The wife's got meatloaf waiting. After Dan and Bill left, Luke decided he could use another beer. Maybe catch up with some of the guys from town. Just be careful around those parts, Luke, Bill had warned. It's gotten a little rough around the edges since you shipped out. Come on, Bill, it ain't, nom. Luke chuckled. He'd laughed, but Luke had to admit, Bill was right. The Rusty Bucket, his old stomping grounds, had definitely seen better days. Graffiti marred the brick facade, and a group of rough-looking characters glared at him from the stoop. Seen worse, Luke muttered under his breath, pushing through the door. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and the murmur of hushed conversations. He bellied up to the bar, ordered a beer, and scanned the crowd. It used to be a place where guys like him, working stiffs and Vietnam vets, could grab a cold one and swap stories. Now, it felt different, tense, dangerous. He didn't recognize a single face. He finished his beer, paid his tab, and headed for the door. As he passed the mouth of the alley next to the bar, a sound stopped him cold, a woman's terrified scream. Luke peered into the darkness. 5, maybe 6 men had a young woman cornered, their shadows twisting menacingly in the dim light. One of them was ripping at her dress. Luke's hand instinctively went to the Bowie knife tucked into the back of his jeans. He slipped it out, the familiar weight reassuring in his hand, and moved silently toward the commotion. Hey, get away from her! Luke roared. The men whirled around, momentarily stunned. One of them, a wiry character with a switchblade, stepped forward. What's it to ya, old man? He sneered, flashing his blade. You want to play with knives? Let's play. Luke said, his voice cold and calm, belying the fury that was building inside him. The thug lunged, but Luke was ready for him. He sidestepped the clumsy attack, slashing out with his own knife, a swift, brutal movement that sent the switchblade skittering across the pavement. The punk crumpled to the ground, clutching his groin and howling in pain. The rest of the gang hesitated, a flicker of fear in their eyes. 2 of them, emboldened by booze or stupidity, charged at Luke. He met one with a right hook that connected with a sickening crunch, sending him sprawling. The other lunged, but Luke slammed the butt of his knife into the side of his head, dropping him like a stone. Suddenly, something slammed into the back of Luke's head. Pain exploded behind his eyes, and he staggered. He spun around just in time to see a figure melt into the shadows. A siren wailed in the distance, growing louder. Man, Miller, didn't Bill warn you this place was in trouble? A police officer stood over him, shaking his head. Yeah, well, guess I'm a little slow on the uptake. Luke winced, touching the tender spot on his head. The officer surveyed the scene. 3 groaning figures sprawled on the ground, and barked into his radio. Better make it 2 ambulances. He cuffed the groaning men, then noticed the Bowie knife still clutched in Luke's hand. Now that's a knife. Where'd you get that beauty? Picked it up in country. Mind if I? The officer gestured to the sheath. Luke handed it to him. The cop turned it over in his hands, examining the inscription. French Foreign Legion, huh? Didn't figure you for a cheese-eating surrender monkey, Miller. Marines. Right, but the markings, definitely Legion. March or die, HMPH. That's some hardcore stuff. You should put this thing somewhere safe before some punk tries to relieve you of it. Frame it, maybe. He handed the knife back. The young woman hurried over, her dress torn and her eyes wide with gratitude. Officer, please, don't arrest him. He saved my life. Those men, they were going to. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The officer studied her torn dress, then looked back at Luke. You need to see a doctor, son. And we're gonna need a statement. You, too, ma'am. I can take him to the officer, the woman said. And I can give you my statement there? Is that all right? The officer considered this for a moment, then nodded. All right, miss. Follow me to the hospital. Hey, Jimmy. He shouted to his partner, who was just arriving. The second officer took one look at the 3 men in cuffs and let out a low whistle. Holy, isn't that Juan Mendoza? The gang leader they've been trying to nail? He was looking at the wiry guy Luke had disarmed. Sure is. The first officer confirmed. And this guy? He gestured to Luke. Took down all three of them. No way. By himself? Looks that way. Unbelievable. The ambulances arrived, sirens wailing, and the paramedics got to work. The first officer helped Luke to his feet. What is it with you Marines? Can't get enough action, huh? He said, a grin spreading across his face. Luke chuckled, even though it hurt. Guess not. Just wanted a quiet beer with the guys. Well, this young lady's gonna take good care of you. Keys, son? Luke dug his keys out of his pocket. My partner can follow you to the hospital and drive your truck back. I'll pick him up when we're done here. And Miller, he added, his voice turning serious. Stay away from this part of town, you hear? It's gone to hell. The Rockwood's got a decent crowd these days. Mostly vets. Safer bet. Thanks, I'll keep that in mind. He followed the young woman, who introduced herself as Darcy Evans, to her car. A beat-up Dodge Dart, probably older than he was. So, you're the guy. The Silver Star hero, she said, starting the engine. Guess that's me, Luke replied. Don't sound too thrilled about it. Darcy glanced at him, a curious expression on her face. How come you're out here brawling, anyway? Shouldn't you be home with your wife? Luke's throat tightened. He couldn't even meet her eyes. Worse, he couldn't hold back the tears that welled up, hot and unwelcome. This woman, this total stranger, seemed to care more about him than his own wife. Oh, God, I am so sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. Darcy stammered. What happened? He told her everything, the months of silence, the stolen money, the betrayal, the chilling plan to get rid of him. By the time he was finished, Darcy had pulled into the mostly empty hospital parking lot. She threw the car into park and turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. She reached for him, and before he knew what was happening, she'd pulled him close, hugging him tightly. You poor thing. That awful woman, she doesn't deserve you. Luke was surprised by her outpouring, by the depth of her empathy. Why are you crying? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Those men, they were going to. Darcy shuddered. But you jumped in, even though you could have been killed. You don't even know me. You risked your life for me. He pulled her close again, holding her tight. You don't owe me anything, Darcy. Yes, I do. I owe you everything. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You pushed your own pain aside to help me, a complete stranger. Now, it's my turn. Let me help you heal. Let me mend your broken heart. I won't let anyone hurt you like that again. I promise. Darcy, you don't even know me. And you don't know me. But after tonight, I think I know all I need to know, Luke Miller. You're my hero. My knight in shining armor. She reached up and gently cupped his cheek. Let me take care of you. Please? He looked into her eyes, saw nothing but genuine concern and a spark of something more. He heard Riley's voice in the back of his head. Go for it, Corporal, Sergeant. Luke smiled. All right, Darcy, he whispered, leaning down to kiss her softly. She melted into his embrace. You won't regret this, Luke. I promise. They walked into the emergency room hand in hand. The doctor cleaned the gash on Luke's cheek, x-rayed his head, and confirmed what he already knew. Nothing broken, just a nasty bump from where that piece of wood had connected. Darcy was fine, just shaken. He gave the attending officer a very condensed version of what had transpired, leaving out anything that could be traced back to Tiffany and Chad. As they were leaving, the officer pulled Luke aside. That girl, Darcy, seems like a good egg, but she's been through a lot. Parents died a few years back, in a car crash. No family, barely scraping by. Waitressing, rough life. I know you got your own stuff going on, but maybe you two could look out for each other, Help each other through this. Thanks. Yeah, maybe you're right. He was surprised by the officer's words, by his concern for Darcy. She'd never mentioned any of that, never asked for pity. She'd just been there for him. He felt a warmth spread through him, a lightness he hadn't felt in what felt like forever. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe it was something more. Whatever it was, it felt a hell of a lot better than anything Tiffany had ever given him. The officer handed Luke his card. "Take care of yourself, Miller. And you, Miss Evans, follow me. I gotta swing by Miller's place anyway, pick up my partner." "Thanks again for everything," Darcy said, her eyes meeting Luke's for a moment before she followed the officer out of the emergency room. They drove back to his place in silence. Luke's mind was a jumble of emotions. His wife had betrayed him, his buddies were gone, and now, here was Darcy. He wasn't one for fate, but he couldn't help but wonder about the strange turns life took. They were both hurting, lost in their own ways, and yet they'd reached out, chosen to be there for each other. When they pulled up to his house, he invited her in. "Come on in, I don't bite. Besides, it's warmer than that death trap you call a car." "I don't want to impose," Darcy said hesitantly, clutching a duffel bag. Luke took it from her. "Don't worry about it, got plenty of room, safer than sleeping in your car, too." Well, if you're sure." He led her inside. After the officers left, he showed her the spare bedroom, his old man's former man cave, now mostly used for storage. He offered her a cup of coffee, and they settled in the living room, her curled up on the couch, him nursing his aching leg in his recliner. They talked late into the night. He told her about his deployment, about the things he'd seen, about the buddies he'd lost. About Tiffany. He told her everything. When it was her turn, Darcy spoke of her own struggles. Her folks had been good people, hard-working but always struggling to make ends meet. They died with nothing but debt, leaving her to pick up the pieces. She'd lost her job as a secretary, ended up waiting tables to pay the bills, and bounced from one crummy apartment to another. The last guy she'd lived with, well, let's just say he hadn't been a gentleman. She'd ended up back in her car, trying to save up enough to start over. "Why don't you stay here?" Luke blurted out before he could stop himself. "What? No, I couldn't. I can't afford to pay rent, and besides, it wouldn't be proper. Not with the divorce and all. I'm not worried about it properly. And you don't have to pay rent. Just help out around here a bit. If anyone asks, we'll say you're a friend who needs a place to crash while you get back on your feet." You'd do that for me?" "Sure, sounds fair to me." "Okay." Darcy agreed, a shy smile spreading across her face. I hope you don't get tired of looking at me." Luke laughed, the sound rusty from lack of use. "Don't worry about that. It's my face I'm worried about." He gestured to the scars on his cheek and ear. Darcy reached out, her fingers lightly tracing the raised skin. "I think I can handle it. Actually," she added with a mischievous grin, "I think it's kind of distinguished. Like someone who doesn't put up with any nonsense. Flattery will get you everywhere." He tried to sound gruff, but her words had warned him more than he wanted to admit. "Listen, things might get a little hectic around here the next few days. Tiffany and her lawyer will be getting served tomorrow, so I expect the phone will be ringing off the hook. Plus, I gotta run some errands." "Need a sidekick? I'm off for the next couple of days." "You sure? It'll be pretty boring stuff." "Sounds like fun to me. Beats washing dishes at the diner, that's for sure." He was exhausted. His leg was throbbing, and he realized he hadn't slept properly in days. "You know what? I'm gonna turn in early. This leg's killin' me." "Mind if I come with?" "No funny business, I promise. I really need someone to hold me right now." He looked into her eyes, saw the vulnerability there, and his chest ached for her. "Sure, Darcy. Climb in. I promise I'll be good." He knew he meant it, too. Right now, sleep and companionship sounded a hell of a lot more appealing than anything else. She disappeared into the bathroom to shower and change. By the time she came back out, wearing an old t-shirt that went down to her knees, he was already tucked in, his back to the wall. She slipped in beside him, and he instinctively put his arm around her. Darcy snuggled into him, her head on his shoulder, her hand resting lightly on his chest. It felt nice. Safe. He woke up to the shrill ringing of the phone. 9:20 a.m. Darcy was still asleep, her head on his chest, his hand tangled in her hair. He gently extricated himself and stumbled to the kitchen, grabbing the receiver on the last ring. "What the hell is this about a divorce, Luke?" Tiffany's voice, shrill and outraged, pierced through the receiver. "I don't want a divorce. And what's this about adultery and abandonment? That's ridiculous." "Oh, really? You don't say." Luke's voice was dangerously quiet. "Let's see, you moved out, stopped paying the bills, cleaned out our accounts, shacked up with Chad Sterling, and oh yeah, you're pregnant with his kid. Need I go on?" I didn't know you were back, Luke. I would have visited you. We could have talked." "Bullshit. It was all over the news, Tiffany. Hell, even strangers on the street congratulated me. You? Too busy shacking up with your lawyer boyfriend to even send a card." "You don't understand. I still love you." "No, you don't. You haven't even bothered to call since last year. My parents had to tell me you were screwing around. You didn't even send a get well card when I was in the hospital." "But, I do. I love you, Luke," she insisted, her voice cracking. "No, you don't," Luke said coldly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "What exactly did you tell Sterling about me raising his kid? Oh, right, you don't love him anymore. That's really convenient. Right now, I hate you so much, Tiffany, I wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire." How did you know?" Tiffany's voice was choked with sobs. "You've never talked to me like this. You don't really mean that, do you? Luke, please, let's just talk this over, sign the papers, and be done with it. Please?" "We're done, Tiffany. Over. And I'm coming for Sterling next." Suddenly, Chad's voice filled the line. "Listen up, you washed up, cripple. You're messing with the wrong guy. I'm gonna destroy you, Miller. You hear me? Destroy you." "Don't think so, pal. Tougher guys than you have tried. They're dead now. You wanna play rough? I'll beat you so bad you'll be begging for mercy. You'll feel like you're tangled with a freight train. And while you're at it, check the papers I sent over. There's a restraining order against you and your little gold-digging girlfriend. I know about your plans, Sterling. Burning down my house, messing with my truck. You come within 100 yards of me, my family, or my property, and I swear to God, I'll put a bullet in your ass. By the time I'm done, you'll be lucky to avoid jail." "We'll see about that, Miller." Chad spat back. Tiffany came back on the line, her voice shaky. "Luke, please, let's just talk about this. We don't need a divorce. Chad and we have a proposal. We want to talk it over with you." "If you want to talk to my lawyer," Luke said. "Here's a better idea. You and your scumbag boyfriend can disappear and stay the hell out of my life." He slammed the phone down, then punched the wall, ignoring the jolt of pain that shot up his arm. "Damn it." Darcy, who had been listening from the doorway, hurried over and wrapped her arms around him. "It's okay, Luke," she soothed. "They deserved that. Every word. Just breathe. Let your lawyer handle it. That's what he's for." He leaned into her, drawing strength from her presence. How can she even say she loves me after all that?" "I don't know, Luke," Darcy said softly. "She's not thinking straight, that's for sure. You said you had errands to run? Let's get out of here, clear your head." "Yeah, good idea. What do we need to do?" "First, drop off your dress blues at the cleaners. Then, gotta stop by Big Ed's. And I need to pick up some parts and tune up my truck." "Let's do this. First, though, I gotta call Dan. Update him on the lovely conversation I just had. Make it quick. We've got a lot to do today." He filled Dan in on the highlights, or rather, the lowlights, of his conversation with Tiffany and Chad. "Yeah, she almost fainted when she heard my voice. And Sterling looked like he wanted to punch something. I'm curious to see what kind of proposal they come up with." Dan paused. "Oh, and Lee Carter called. He's meeting with the partners and the board this afternoon. And Luke, make sure those dress blues are ready. Court date next Friday." "Got it. Thanks, Dan. I'll keep you posted." They left the house, Luke's dress blues and medals carefully draped over Darcy's arm. They dropped them off at the dry cleaners, a grizzled old Korean war vet who handled Luke's precious uniform with reverence. Then they headed over to Big Ed's. "Hey, boss," Luke called out as they walked in. Big Ed glanced up from a mountain of paperwork. "'Bout time you showed up, son. And I ain't just talking about that bonus check." He gestured to the overflowing in tray with a sigh. "Damn, I need a secretary. Can't keep up with all this paperwork. Got cars to fix." Luke glanced at Darcy, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Seriously, Ed, you want to hire a secretary?" "Damn straight. Look at this mess. Plus, I gotta answer the phones, deal with customers, it's killing me. You know anybody who's good with a typewriter and can handle a cranky old cuss like me?" "Actually, I might know someone. She's looking for a better job. Interested?" "Hell yes." Luke gently took Darcy's arm. "Ed, meet my friend Darcy Evans. She's a whiz with a typewriter." Big Ed looked her up and down, assessing her with a gruff but not unkind gaze. "Think you can handle all this, little lady?" Darcy straightened her back and met his gaze. "Absolutely. I can type 50 words a minute, file, take shorthand, handle customers, I even know my way around a cash register." Big Ed stroked his chin, considering. "You working, now?" "I'm a waitress at the Starlight Diner. But the pay's lousy, and the tips are worse. Tell you what, you give those diner folks your notice, then come see me. Start you at $25 a week. Since you're a friend of Luke's, I'll even throw in a free oil change." "Oh, thank you, Mr. Johnson. You won't regret this." Darcy beamed. "You know anything about cars?" Big Ed asked, eyeing her curiously. "Not as much as Luke, but my dad taught me a few things. I can change a tire, check the oil, even tune up an engine if I have to." "Even better." Big Ed chuckled. He turned to Luke. "Oh, almost forgot. Welcome home, son." He handed Luke a thick envelope. "Consider it a bonus. You earned it." Luke opened the envelope and stared at the check. $2,340. He shook Ed's hand, his throat tight with gratitude. "Thank you, Ed. This really means a lot." "Don't mention it. Now go take care of that no-good wife of yours and get back to work." "Will do, boss." As they walked out, Darcy let out a whoop of delight. $25 a week. I've never made that much in my life. Luke, thank you. You're a lifesaver." "Hey, it was all Big Ed. Don't thank me. That's almost twice what I make as a sergeant in the Corps." "No way." "Yep, Uncle Sam's a cheapskate." "You weren't kidding about knowing cars?" "Nope, didn't have a lot growing up, so Dad taught me how to fix things myself. Learned to tune up a car, change belts and tires, everything." "Don't let Big Ed hear that. He'll have you elbow deep in grease before you know it." Luke teased. Darcy laughed. "I don't mind getting my hands dirty. Just point me towards the toolbox. I'll even show you a thing or two." He was smitten. "Wow, Darcy, I think I'm falling for you." Darcy giggled and gave him a quick kiss on the cheek. "Me too." They swung by the bank, where Luke deposited his bonus check, tucking 10% into savings like always. He withdrew $100 for spending money and ordered new checks, this time, without Tiffany's name on them. Next stop, the auto parts store, where he loaded up on everything he needed for his truck. After grabbing a quick burger, they headed back to Luke's place. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so at peace. Having Darcy around made the house feel like a home again. He pulled the truck into the garage and started hauling out tools and supplies. Darcy disappeared inside and re-emerged a few minutes later, transformed. She'd traded her dress for a pair of faded jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. "So, where do we start, boss?" she asked, a playful twinkle in her eyes. "How about you tackle those plugs and wires while I drain the oil?" "You got it." Darcy grabbed a handful of spark plugs and wires, then paused. "You got a feeler gauge? Need to check the gaps on these plugs." "You know how to set a gap?" Seriously? She just grinned, grabbed a set of wrenches, and got to work. Luke watched her for a moment, amazed at how comfortable she was with his tools. He'd tried to get Tiffany interested in his projects, but she'd always complained about grease under her nails. He shook his head, grabbed a drain pan, and got to work. By the time he was finished with the oil change, Darcy had replaced the spark plugs, wires, rotor, and distributor cap. He inspected her work, flawless. But looks could be deceiving. "Time for the real test," he said, lowering the truck back onto its wheels. He slid behind the wheel, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. He revved it a couple of times, listening for any telltale signs of trouble. Nothing, just the sweet purr of a well-tuned engine. He shut it off and grinned at Darcy, who was now sporting a healthy coating of grease on her face and hands. At that moment, she looked more beautiful to him than Tiffany ever had. "So, how'd I do?" she asked, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of grease across her cheek. He cupped her face in his greasy hands and kissed her deeply. "You're definitely hired." She laughed, unfazed by the grease on his hands. "Glad to hear it, boss." He handed her a rag and a can of hand cleaner. After they'd cleaned up, Darcy insisted on cooking dinner. Later, they watched TV, sharing a comfortable silence. Luke felt more relaxed than he had in months. For the first time since he'd been home, he managed to fall asleep without the ghosts of his past haunting his dreams. The next few days were a whirlwind. Luke picked up his dress blues from the cleaners and spent hours meticulously removing any stray threads, polishing his brass buckles until they gleamed. Darcy marched into the Starlight Diner and gave her boss a piece of her mind, and her 2 weeks' notice. The boss, a greasy character who'd been making passes at her since day one, told her she could leave right then and there. No 2 weeks necessary. She was to pick up her last paycheck in a few days. Fine by her. The days leading up to the court hearing flew by in a flurry of activity and shared laughter. Luke and Darcy grew closer, their connection deepening. They decided to hold off on taking their relationship further until the divorce was finalized. It was a challenge for Luke. It had been a long time, and he was finding himself falling for Darcy more and more each day. Thankfully, she seemed to feel the same. The day of the hearing arrived, and Luke woke up with a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He showered, shaved, and carefully dressed in his uniform. When he walked into the living room, Darcy was waiting for him, radiant in a simple but elegant printed dress. "Wow," she breathed, her eyes widening as she took in his crisp uniform, adorned with his medals. "You look fantastic." "Thanks." Luke chuckled, tugging at his collar. "I feel like a Christmas tree." "Don't worry, it's a good look on you. And you clean up nice yourself, Miss Evans." At the courthouse, they were met by a contingent of 14 Marines from Luke's unit, including Lieutenant Colonel Walker and Sergeant Major Roberts. After a round of introductions and handshakes, they entered the courtroom. The Marines filed into 2 rows, their presence a silent show of support. Luke took his place beside Dan at the table. His parents sat with the Marines. Across the aisle, he saw Tiffany and Chad. Tiffany's eyes widened when she saw him. The scars, the missing part of his ear, they clearly shocked her. Chad just smirked, his hand resting possessively on Tiffany's swollen belly. He noticed Darcy sitting beside Luke and his smirk faltered a bit. The judge entered the courtroom, and the bailiff called the room to order. "Gentlemen," the judge addressed the Marines, his voice a low rumble. "What brings you here today?" Lieutenant Colonel Walker stood up. "Your Honor, my men and I are here to show our support for Sergeant Miller. And to speak on his behalf, if needed." "Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate the gesture. I don't anticipate needing character witnesses, but I commend your loyalty." The Marines remained silent but fixed Tiffany and Chad with stony stares throughout the proceedings. The hearing went just as Dan had predicted. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman, questioned both parties, covering the history of their marriage and the reasons for the divorce filing. Tiffany admitted to abandoning the house, neglecting to pay the bills, and getting pregnant by Chad. Chad, in a moment of breathtaking audacity, tried to convince the judge to order Luke to pay child support for the baby. You actually expect me to order Mr. Miller to support a child you fathered? The judge asked, her voice laced with incredulity. Are you serious, counselor? Or just not thinking clearly? Chad spluttered, trying to regain his footing, but the judge shut him down. She systematically denied every motion and request he made. In the end, she ruled in Luke's favor. He got the house, a permanent restraining order against Tiffany and Chad, and no child support payments. Tiffany was ordered to return half of the money she'd stolen from their joint accounts and revert to her maiden name. The judge waived the requirement to return her reins, noting that, according to Mr. Miller's testimony, they were no longer in her possession. Chad protested, his face red with anger, but the judge silenced him with a sharp rap of her gavel. Mr. Sterling, she said, pointing her gavel at him. I am ordering a full investigation into your conduct in this matter. At the very least, there appears to be a significant conflict of interest. I also understand that the district attorney is looking into other possible criminal activity, including conspiracy. And I am aware of the lawsuit filed against you for alienation of affection. Your actions and your testimony here today will be taken into consideration. She slammed the gavel down. Mr. Miller's petition for divorce is granted. Chad shot out of his chair, his face contorted with rage. You bastard! He screamed, lunging across the aisle toward Luke. I'm gonna kick your ass, Miller. You hear me? I'll make your life a living hell. And that goes for anyone who gets in my way. The bailiff reacted swiftly, grabbing Chad by the arm and pulling him back. Don't think so, Sterling, Luke said calmly, watching Chad struggle against the bailiff's grip. He glanced at the Marines, who were glaring at Chad and Tiffany with undisguised hostility. Tiffany stared at the floor, her face flushed with shame. A tall, silver-haired man Luke recognized as Robert Carter, the firm's senior partner, approached Chad. You're fired, Sterling. Effective immediately. I'm also filing a complaint with the state bar. Pack your things and get out of my office by the end of the day. He cast a withering glance at Tiffany as Chad stormed out, muttering obscenities. As for you, Ms. Taylor, you're still employed, at least until after the baby arrives. We'll re-evaluate your performance then. Carter turned to Luke and extended his hand. Thank you for your service, Sergeant Miller. On behalf of the partnership and the board, I want to apologize for what you've been through. He turned to Dan. Given the circumstances and in light of Mr. Miller's service to our country, the board has decided to accept your initial offer. We see no need for further litigation. Please contact my office next week to finalize the paperwork. Thanks, Lee. I'll call Monday. Carter smiled grimly. Good. Maybe now I can finally win some of my money back from you on the golf course. As Carter exited the courtroom, Darcy walked over to Luke and hugged him tightly. He held her for a long moment, savoring the feel of her in his arms. As he pulled away, he noticed Tiffany watching them, tears streaming down her face. Luke, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Well, you did, he said simply. I need to know why, Tiffany. Why did you do it? Tiffany shrugged helplessly. I don't know. You were gone. Chad was there. I was lonely. And maybe I started thinking about the money. Being broke all the time was getting old. One thing led to another, and, well, you know the rest. You were gonna let him raise that kid? As his own? He thought you'd be okay with it. If I stayed with him, I mean. I wasn't crazy about the idea at first, but it kinda grew on me. Luke just shook his head, speechless. Tiffany glanced at Darcy, her eyes narrowing. You sure didn't waste any time replacing me. Darcy stepped forward, her gaze steady. I'm not replacing you. I'm here to heal a good man's heart. The heart you broke. And I intend to spend the rest of my life doing just that. Tiffany looked down at her feet. I guess I deserve that. She looked up at Luke, her eyes filled with regret. Do you think we could ever be friends again? I don't know, Tiffany. You hurt me pretty bad. If it weren't for Darcy and my family, I might not even be here. I didn't know, Luke. I'm really sorry. She turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped. Luke shook hands with Dan. By now, the Marines and his parents had gathered around. "Thanks for everything, Dan. I owe you big time." "Hey, what are friends for? Besides, I've always wanted to see Sterling get his comeuppance." He clapped Luke on the shoulder. "You got a big payday coming. Go out and celebrate. You earned it." After shaking hands with the Marines and gathering his things, Dan headed out. "Well done, Sergeant." Lieutenant Colonel Walker offered his hand. The other Marines followed suit, shaking Luke's hand and offering congratulations. "We're so proud of you, son," his mom said, pulling him into a hug. "And who is this lovely lady?" She turned to Darcy, a warm smile on her face. Luke beamed. "Mom, Dad, this is Darcy Evans. She saved my life." His parents enveloped Darcy in a hug, welcoming her into the fold-like family. "You need to bring her over for dinner soon, Luke," Martha insisted, patting Darcy's hand. "I hope to do that a lot from now on," Luke said, giving Darcy a warm smile. Life, as it often does, moved on. Tiffany lost the baby. A miscarriage. The doctor told her it was unlikely she'd ever carry a child to term. Carter kept her on at the firm, but under a strict contract that forbade any romantic entanglements with colleagues. She stayed single, focused on her work. Luke would sometimes see her around town. A fleeting glimpse of her watching him and Darcy's kids at the park. It was a look he couldn't quite decipher. Regret? Envy? Sadness? Then one rainy afternoon, she was gone, killed instantly in a car accident on the highway. Luke, Darcy, and his parents attended the funeral, standing silently beside a grave adorned with lilies. Chad didn't fare much better. He lost most of his money fighting the legal battles, losing to Luke in court and failing to appeal to the state bar. The DA wanted to press charges, but there wasn't enough solid evidence. Then, late one night, he was jumped by a group of masked men outside a bar. They left him with a broken jaw, several missing teeth, and a chilling message scrawled on a piece of cardboard tied around his neck. A few weeks later, he was found hanging from a bridge. Suicide, the coroner ruled. Luke proposed to Darcy the day his divorce was finalized. They were married a month later, a simple ceremony with a traditional Marine sword arch. They kept working for Big Ed until he passed away in 1980, leaving the shop to Luke in his will. Luke stayed in the reserves, retiring as a master gunnery sergeant in '92, a year after Desert Storm. The dreams of Vietnam still came, sometimes, but he'd made peace with them, with the ghosts of his past. He and Darcy ran Big Ed's auto repair together, a true partnership, until they retired in 2008, handing the keys to their two sons. They were happy, content. He was loved. Life was good. 10 years later, they were window shopping in Missoula when Luke spotted it. A framed drawing of a rose, almost identical to the tattoo he'd almost gotten in Da Nang all those years ago. An idea took root, one that blossomed with certainty. He walked into the tattoo parlor and asked for the artist. Darcy followed, confused. "What are you doing, Luke?" He took her hand, his eyes filled with love. "I want your name right here, Darcy," he said, tapping his chest, right over his heart. "You promised to heal my heart all those years ago. You did. And now, I want the whole world to know how much I love you." Darcy's eyes filled with tears. "Luke, you don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. I owe you everything." She sat down, knowing that once Luke set his mind to something, there was no changing it. "You sure about this, Gramps?" the young tattoo artist asked. Luke pulled off his shirt, revealing the faded scars that crisscrossed his chest. "Absolutely." "Okay, man, let's do this." The artist prepped his tools. Will it hurt?" Darcy asked. "Yeah, doll, it's gonna hurt like hell. But it's worth it." She smiled through her tears, watching as the artist's needle began to etch her name onto his skin, a permanent testament to a love born in the ashes of a broken heart. As the dust settles on a life once filled with pain and betrayal, Luke Miller finds peace in the love that has grown from the ashes of his past. His journey, marked by the scars of war and a broken heart, leads him to a deeper understanding of what it means to be truly loved and cherished. With Darcy by his side, Luke rebuilds his life, proving that even in the darkest times, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. Their story is a testament to the power of resilience, the healing touch of love, and the belief that, no matter what life throws your way, you can find your way back to happiness.